I happened to come across this little picnic area. I pulled in and saw the light coming down through here, kind of backlighting these leaves in the tree, and I love it. So I think I'm gonna just sit here and see what I can do. When sketching, one thing that you can do if you're trying to like really be accurate with your lines and the forms, you can use your pencil or brush and tilt it to match the angle of your subject. And this is really helpful when doing architecture or scenes with really obvious perspective. But you can tilt your pencil like that, and now I know the angle of that. And if I keep my pencil at that exact angle and put it down on the paper, I'll know what that angle of the tree is. When it comes to the plan of action for the painting, what I'm going to try to do is block in some of the really, really light areas like these leaves, maybe some of these background leaves, so that I know they're there, and maybe get some of this ground light. And then from there, just kind of try to keep working my way back to the darkest values. This might be a time when masking fluid would have came in handy, but like I mentioned before, I'm not a huge fan of masking fluid. So I just try to paint around my highlights. And what I try to do is paint my highlights larger than they will be in the end, because it's pretty common to cover them up more than I meant to. So like this leafy area here and some of the leaves back here, I'm gonna make pretty big, because I know like later when I come back in to paint around these areas, they are gonna be quite smaller, much smaller. And my goal now isn't to get like a hyper realistic impression of these leaves. It's more about the light in the painting. So I'm just using really warm yellowish green, and then the contrast against the darker background is gonna hopefully show what a cool backlit scene this was, and hopefully the viewer will get it. I try to pick one or two things in each scene that I love, and that's what I focus on. So in this case, it's the light. It's the backlit leaves. It's just so bright and beautiful. Oh, also I want to point out there are different types of backlit. So if we focus in on here, so the leaves that are in the tree that are backlit are a much warmer green, and these leaves down here on the ground that are top lit, they're actually a bluer light, which I know is not showing in the video, but when I paint those, I'm going to do more of a really, really light bluish green, because they're actually reflecting the sky more. So that I don't forget, I'm going to add in the lighter area of the pine tree that's back there. So I'm going with a cooler blue, so it's, you know, kind of in the background. And these will still be my brightest, warmest areas. Now I'm trying to lay in some of the shadow below that pine tree back there. This branch is going to be silhouetted, so I don't have to worry about that right now. So at the moment, yeah, I'm just trying to get this darker green transitioning into the warmer green in the foreground. And because I don't want it to dry with hard edges, I'm going to soften it. And then the cool thing about that is I now have tons of time to make the rest of it work. So that just gives you a little extra time, and you don't have to worry about hard edges. And I'll continue painting around my leaves here. I think as long as I allow some of those lighter areas, like spiky type shapes, to peek through, it should look like leaves, but we'll see. Something I'm trying to work on is brush confidence, where I have a plan of action and I just go for it. So when you guys listen to me in these videos, I feel like I sound more confident than I actually am. I guess that just comes with time and experience. All I can do is keep putting brush strokes down and see what happens, and then, you know, learn from each each painting. And sometimes it doesn't work out. Quite often it doesn't work out, but I still learn something. So it's not like, you know, because it's not just because it didn't turn out exactly as I hoped, it's a failure. I still find a lot of value in those situations because I'm filming myself and sharing the process does not mean I know what I'm doing all the time. Half the time I'm just experimenting and deciding if it worked or not, and then, you know, if it did, then I can use that in the future. I'm gonna make a nice light purple with my yellow ochre, a little bit of my potter's pink, pyrrolene violet, and ultramarine. It's like a light grayish, brownish purple. And for some of these background trees that are just kind of there to make it look a little bit more full, just throw that in. For some of these foreground bushes, I'm just gonna do little lines of perylene green, pretty much pure perylene green, which is kind of like a blackish green, while it's still wet, so that parts of the lines blur and then other parts are harder edged, so that it just indicates that there's a lot of, you know, roughage down there. And then while it's also wet, I drop in a little bit of some like thick, solid, either my Serpentine Genuine or Diopside Green, which is, they're both very granulating, and if they bleed, I end up with beautiful textures. I've darkened the camera scene just a little so you can see. When I first got here, the shadows were coming this way, and that's the direction I'm going to paint them. But now you can see they're actually coming down towards me. So, you know, that's what happens when you're out painting. Stuff changes really quick. But I think for my composition that it works better. I think that it'll work better if I keep my initial idea with the shadows coming this way, because I like how it would kind of like have this open space where you're looking and then your eye kind of wraps into the tree and the shadow kind of brings you back down and around. But first I'm going to mix up a nice batch of trunk color, and I'm going to go with my ultramarine, potter's pink. So now it's got a little bit more purple, but that's, potter's pink is nice and granulating. A little perylene violet, so it's even more purple, and my quinacridone burnt orange. So now I have a nice brownish, deep brownish, grayish. It's like so many colors, but it's a deep color, and it's still cooler. And then on the edges of that, I can touch in some warmth. So this is my shadow color of the trees. And I was pretty generous with that mix. I made quite a lot of it. Also at the base of my tree, I'm going to make it kind of spiky so it goes down into the grass without like a solid edge there. And I'm going to be careful with painting around some of the foliage so that it looks like they're in front of the trees. So I have a variety of that. See, I actually didn't mix enough of it. But yeah, before that dries, I'll touch in some warmth with my yellow ochre and potter's pink, just along the edge. Sorry. I want it to bleed and be kind of like heavily granulating there. So I have quite a generous mix on there. And when it dries, hopefully it'll be very, it'll give me a nice variety instead of just like a solid tree trunk, which wouldn't be very good. And then at the base of the trees, and now I'm going to touch in my green so that I don't get too many hard edges there. That color that I put down, that shadow color, it's very staining and it dries really fast. So as you can see, I do have some edges there, which I think is okay. For my shadow color, I'm going to mix that bluish green. And on the shadow side, I'll touch those in. Kind of just have that dragging off to the edge. And my yellowish green on the other side. But I want it to bleed down there and be nice transition. Okay, so you can see here the part I painted around the leaves started to dry really fast, so I need to make sure I don't neglect that. And I'm gonna grab my teeny little script brush and do some grasses. Just around the base of that tree. And this part, I also want to make sure I pick up some of that because this branch is in front of that background tree. I have to admit that this background tree with the pine tree, I am so tempted to come back in and add shadows underneath the boughs that are hanging there. But I'm not going to, because when I back up from this painting, I really love how soft that background is compared to the foreground. So I'm going to force myself to just stop. I'm going to ignore that because I don't want to overdo it. I don't want the background to be a lot of hard edges as well as the foreground, because then I think it'll be too much, too chaotic. Before I do the foreground branch, I want to show you what I meant with getting a variety of texture and granulation and color in the bark. So by mixing a lot of colors together in that first initial wash, especially some that are very granulating, and of course the cold pressed paper texture, I get this beautiful variation. And you can spend ages trying to perfect that, but for me, my opinion, I love when watercolor just does its thing and makes those magical little areas. And I feel like those are some of my favorite things in the paintings. I also have one back here on this tree that I love, how it kind of just bleeds down into that darkness. Now I'm going to come back in with that silhouetted branch. And then just kind of letting it curl down, trying to get some of the broken branches that happen. Or not broken, but like how I don't draw the whole branch. I let some of it kind of disappear behind those leaves so that it indicates that it's behind them. And now that I can see what value that needs to be, I can adjust the other nearby areas to work with that. First I had to put that down so I knew, like, you know, how dark it needed to be to cover the background, and now I can come back and do all the rest. So I actually want to add a little bit of some light on that right there. So I'm just touching in some of my yellow ochre and potter's pink, and maybe even a little bit here and there down here. This will dry a little bit lighter than what you see there, so hopefully by the time it dries it will be the perfect tone. If not, you'll see what we can do, but I'm hoping that I did it okay with that mix. Getting used to this new palette has been a challenge, like figuring out how dark the colors dry. Or how light they dry, I mean. Because usually watercolor dries a lot lighter. And just doing a little bit of rim light on these branches. Yellow ochre is pretty opaque, so it will definitely show up on that darkness as long as it's thick enough. And I feel like it just adds a little bit more depth to those thin branches because they were a little too boring just being pure dark before. It's officially done and goes to show you how much can change in the matter of, 20 minutes. The scene you're now seeing is totally overcast and there's no dramatic shadows or light coming through. So I'm really glad I captured that brightness from the very beginning of the painting because to me, that was what made it interesting. Back in the studio, I spent some time observing what I had done, and straight away it was pretty clear to me that I needed to spend more time mixing color as well as being more careful about painting around my highlights. So I used my color mixing charts and my notes to select a range of mixes that I felt would better suit this scene, and I just got started. So my first lesson learned was that it would have benefited the painting to have some more softer elements in the distance. So I started with a really large wash of wet color, and this allowed me to do some more wet into wet effects, which leads me straight into my second lesson learned, which was to consider my color relationships more thoroughly. In the study, I felt that the stark contrast between the green and the purple was a bit too harsh. And while it's a really fun stylistic choice, in the studio I wanted to be more true to life. So I spent a lot more time mixing and placing colors that had a more subtle shift on the spectrum. And the goal was to create a very light and airy feel in the forest while still capturing that beautiful light that was pouring through the trees. Some of the choices I made here were to use more bluish grays in the distance rather than just jumping straight into the deep colors and the purples. The really wonderful thing about taking these studies back into the studio for further practice is that I can take as much time as I need to create the effects that I saw in person, whereas when I'm painting outside, I feel way more rushed. And because I'm not rushed in the studio, I can spend longer building up my layers and using a glazing technique. So this allowed me to focus more on lesson learned number 3, which was to work a bit more on those backlit leaves, because those are some of the key features in the scene, and I really wanted to render them properly. A lot of people ask me why I don't use masking fluid, and because clearly it would be useful in a situation like this, right? But honestly, I have just always hated it. It's gross. I hate the gooiness, the smell, and the fact that it just really slows down my workflow. And I would rather spend this extra time training myself to see and paint around my highlights. And since the majority of my painting happens outside, I'm never gonna have masking fluid with me out there. Therefore, I just continue to train myself in, creating these highlights freehand. Maybe that sounds a bit harsh, but I don't know, it's just something I've always preferred. To each their own, right? As I mentioned, one of the goals in this painting was to create more subtle color shifts. So I mixed in a little more blue and yellow here and there to dilute the greens and try to create a more natural flow between my warms and my cools. Obviously, I'm still using purple and more stylized choices, but I was just trying to create a more natural feel to it. So in my study, I really enjoyed how the background was super soft and it kind of all just flowed together. But in this one, I did want to do more detail back here. However, I tried not to go overboard. So I made some of these forms back here, bigger masses, and more connected colors. All of that extra time spent considering and mixing color, as well as more carefully rendered forms, meant that the entire painting took about 2 hours compared to the 20 minutes that I spent outside. But it was a very enjoyable process, and it's actually pretty therapeutic to take my sweet time playing with the colors and the shifts and the details. I feel like I'm constantly jumping between loving quicker, more stylized paintings and these longer, more carefully detailed paintings. My fourth lesson learned was that I wasn't very pleased with how the values in my study turned out. And while that heavy contrast does make an eye-catching painting, I couldn't really replicate that here and still create that light and airy feel I was going for. So I took it down a notch and I used a smaller tonal range. My fifth lesson learned was that while I loved the spontaneous and really interesting textures I achieved in the wet into wet bark on the study, I was going for more detail in the studio version, so I used a glazing technique instead. I really wanted to create that sense of shadows falling across the branches and trunks, so I glazed over the brown with a more bluish purple tint. Speaking of trees, if you haven't seen it already, I have a whole big Skillshare class about drawing and painting trees, so check that out if you'd like more thought on trees. Even though I really loved the shadow in the study, I also really liked the look of combining this softer background shadow underneath a more wispy, grassy shadow with this glaze. And you know I can't resist a good splatter, so I threw caution to the wind and I added a bit more spontaneity in this final layer. I really hope you guys enjoyed this lesson learned video. I know it was a bit different with the time lapse, but it was such a long process that I just didn't want to have like a 2-hour video. I'm really hoping you all learned something along with me, because I learned a ton in this painting process. So for now, I hope you guys are staying well and inspired, and I'll see you again soon.